Thank you, Jane. So welcome everyone to this webinar about the general principles for coding of medication errors and other types of deviations from the labeled medicinal product use. I'm Carol Ann Wilson and work as a medical officer at the MSSO. I will be your instructor today, and I'm supported by my colleague Jane Knight, who was speaking to you before. So together we will take you through this webinar, which will last for about 2 hours. As Jane has already mentioned, we want to make this webinar interactive. So please submit your questions or send us your comments through the question panel that you can find in the control panel on the right hand of your screen. And I will allow as much time as possible for questions, both during the webinar and at the end of the presentation. But please do not raise specific coding questions, as we can't help you with individual verbatim terms. We will rather guide you in terms of coding principles. Now let me switch off my camera now and start with the presentation. Here we are. You all know that ICH adopted the development of MedDRA in the mid-90s and became the owner of the terminology as well. ICH then, on contract, appointed the MSSO to take care of the maintenance and further development of the terminology based on user feedback, to provide and organize corresponding training as the one that we have today, and to administer the MedDRA licensees. And all these MSSO activities are overseen by the ICH MedDRA Management Committee. ICH is not only the owner of MedDRA itself, but also owns this training material. It is protected worldwide. You may use the slides with the exception of the MedDRA and ICH logos, but will have to clearly indicate that ICH owns the copyright. Also, any adaptations of the slides have to be clearly labeled. The second bullet point refers to warranty and liability issues you should be aware of. And the third bullet point on the slide is not relevant for today because we will not be using any third-party slides. Now let me provide you with an overview on what we will cover in this webinar. At first, we will explore the regulatory background for today's topic. We will then discuss definitions and terminologies for product use concepts based on the ICH guidance document. And after that, we will look into the general principles for coding of medication errors, and then apply these principles in exercises using the MedDRA browser. And we will conclude with a question and answer session as mentioned at the beginning of the session, but we will address your questions throughout the session as well. This slide now explains about the quiz questions, the polling that we will use during the webinar. The easiest way to join these activities is to scan this QR code with your smartphone, and it will bring you directly to the poll. And as soon as I activate the first question, you'll be able to see it and respond. Alternatively, you may enter the indicated web address, paulf.com, into the URL bar at the top of your internet browser in your computer, tablet, or cell phone. It will then take you to a log on screen, and you'll be asked for a username. Please note that this poll is completely anonymous, so you don't need to enter your name, but please enter my credentials as the username, that is Carol N. Wills 584, with no spaces, and then click join. Nothing else needs to be entered. I just leave this on the screen for a moment so that you can enter the required information or scan this QR code, but you don't have to get under time pressure because you'll be able to see these credentials on each slide that relates to the quizzes. And Jane has also put this information in the chat. Should you lose connection to the poll during the session, just let us know, and I can also show the QR code in between. I see that many of you have joined already. Nice to see this. I see South Africa. I see lots of people in Europe, also in Africa, Egypt. I see Namibia, no, it disappeared, South Africa. Australia is there, Philippines, South Korea, China, India, Russia is there, Scandinavian countries, Cyprus, lots of people in Eurasia, Africa, and Australia. So nice to meet you all. Thank you for joining. And now let's get started with our topic today. That is medication errors and other product use issues. And we will first look into the regulatory background, because this is an important topic that is in focus of many regulatory authorities around the world. Medication errors are critical. They are an important problem in healthcare. And they are not only of great importance for the patients concerned, but also have a huge impact on healthcare costs. They represent the most frequent preventable reason for adverse events in the use of medicinal products. And since they are actually preventable, they are in the focus of regulatory authorities. Depending on countries and regions, they support the recording, coding, reporting, and evaluation of these errors in order to gain new insights into the extent and causes of these errors. With the intention, of course, to develop improved strategies for their prevention to better protect patient safety, but also to reduce healthcare costs, because the costs associated with medication errors could be much better used in other areas of the healthcare system. The fact that medication errors are in the focus of regulatory authorities is also reflected by new guidances that have been published or are in preparation. You may already be familiar with a good practice guide on recording, coding, reporting, and assessing medication errors of the European Medicines Agency. Just one example. The FDA has also published various guidance documents to help avoid medication errors, and you can see some of them here on the screen. They relate to proprietary names, they relate to non-proprietary naming of biological products, safety considerations for product design to minimize medication errors, etc. As stated earlier, regulatory requirements may differ between regions, so make yourself familiar with your local requirements. These are just examples. The regulatory initiatives mentioned have also led to the addition of new terms to MedDRA, together with the restructuring of the hierarchy in order to better support specific coding, but also subsequent data retrieval and assessment of medication errors and other types of product use issues. And they also led to updates and amendments of the relevant points to consider documents to provide more guidance for these coding scenarios. You may think that this topic is only relevant to the post-marketing sector, but this is not the case. It is also relevant for clinical development, for clinical studies, because also in clinical studies, you may find that infusion rates were too high, or doses were too high whatsoever. And as an example, in May last year, the FDA and the Reagan-Udall Foundation for the FDA convened a virtual public meeting on the potential medication error risks with investigational drug container labels. The risk of medication errors related to the content and format of information on investigational drug container labels was explored. The prevalence and nature of medication errors and practices that might minimize the potential for such errors. The recorded event is still available on the web if you are interested in it. Are there any questions so far, Jane? If not,
no, Caroline, no questions so far.
Okay. So as mentioned already, the PTC documents have also been updated and supplemented to provide more guidance and assistance to MedDRA users on this topic. Let us first look at the MedDRA term selection points to consider document. Here's the cover page of the latest version of the document that was released in beginning of March this year. So this is, so to say, the coding Bible, and provides term selection advice for industry and regulatory purposes, and has, of course, the objective to promote accurate and consistent term selection to use the same language to facilitate a common understanding of shared data. If you look into the table of contents, you will see that the guidance for medication errors and other product use issues like misuse, abuse, addiction, plus off-label use is quite short. And this is different with an additional ICH guidance document, the so-called PTC companion document, points to consider companion document, that provides more detailed information, more examples, and guidance on medication errors and other types of product use concepts. It is a living document that is updated as needed. It is not newly released beginning of March each year like the other points to consider document for MedDRA term selection. So the latest release of this document is from October 2020, and it's release 2.0. And it's shown on the slides, on this slide. So in the companion document, you'll find much more detailed explanations and instructions. I can only recommend taking a close look at these 25 pages. They are really very helpful to better understand the terminology and classification of such events, with many practical examples. Now let me show you where to find these documents. Here we are on the MedDRA website, and if you click on how to use, you see here a header support documentation. And when clicking on this support documentation, you'll be brought to this page here, and here you have the points to consider documents and MedDRA best practices document. Here is the MedDRA term selection points to consider document, and also the companion document in different formats. So this is where you can find it. In some instances, these documents are also translated into other languages. Let me select, for instance, what do we have here? Portuguese, Español, Spanish, and you'll see that here the screen now changes to Spanish, and if I open it, you see that here you'll find these PTC documents in Spanish. Same is true for Russian, for instance, and Portuguese. But it's not the case for all MedDRA languages, just to warn you. So here we are. This was a companion document, as I said, really helpful, many examples. It helps to really understand the specificity of the terms that you'll find in MedDRA and how to distinguish them. Before we go into further details, we will have to familiarize ourselves with the terms that refer to medication errors and other product use errors and issues. Here, the definition of the term medication error. A medication error is any preventable event that may result in the improper use of medication or harm to the patient, while the medication is under the control of those involved in the medication process, meaning physicians, pharmacists, nurses, patients, consumers, or their families. So this second aspect that is highlighted in green here is important to remember. These errors occur during product use in the medication process, when the product is in use under the control of the healthcare provider, patient, or consumer. The term does not refer to errors that occur during manufacturing or are caused by wholesalers, in other words, outside of the control of the healthcare provider, patient, or consumer. Medication and other product use errors may be related to professional practice, the products themselves, and healthcare processes and systems, including prescribing, communication of orders, product labeling, product packaging and nomenclature, preparation of products and their dispensing, distribution and administration, as well as related education and product monitoring. The PTC document for MedDRA term selection contains a table on page 31 that facilitates the rough classification of product use errors and problems. And 3 criteria are used for this purpose. Was the deviation intentional, a conscious decision, or did it happen in error? Was it unintentional? And who has caused this event? Who triggered it? The patient or consumer, or the healthcare professional? And did it happen in the context of therapeutic use of the product, yes or no? So as you can see here, misuse, abuse, addiction, these concepts are always occur intentionally. They are triggered by patient consumer. In the instance of misuse, it occurs in the framework of therapeutic use. Abuse, addiction, these do not occur in the framework of therapeutic use. And you see this little asterisk here. So definitions of misuse may not always include the concept of therapeutic use. Misuse may be similar to the concept of abuse in some regions, like for instance, German-speaking countries. So sometimes these terms are not used consistently on a global level, just to make you aware. But in general, this is the classification of these concepts. Now, a medication error, of course, is not intentional, it's always accidental. It can be triggered by both the patient consumer or the healthcare professional, and they occur in the framework of therapeutic use for therapeutic purposes. When the drug is used or the medicinal product is used for medicinal purposes. Off-label use is intentional, a conscious decision by a healthcare professional, and again for a therapeutic purpose. So this is a rough classification of these concepts. Now let me illustrate these scenarios with some practical examples. So here we have Lisa, and Lisa has stress at work, at her workplace. So in the first scenario, the doctor prescribes 1 tablet of a sleeping pill a night to help her sleep better. But since she is still awake at 3 o'clock in the morning, she decides to take another tablet. This is a conscious decision on her part, a deviation from the prescribed treatment regimen for therapeutic purposes. In other words, an intentional misuse of medication and intentional drug misuse in this instance. In the second scenario, a friend advises her to look for painkillers in the internet to calm down. She orders the medication and takes 1 tablet a day at first, but then continuously increases the dose to 4 tablets a day by now. Here we also have a conscious decision by Lisa to take these painkillers to calm down, so she deviates from the actual therapeutic indication and gradually takes too much of them. This now constitutes a product abuse, here a drug abuse. In the third scenario, Lisa does not tolerate the sleeping pill. She is dazed after waking up, so the doctor prescribes her a painkiller off-label instead. Here we have a conscious decision by the doctor for therapeutic purposes, and we also know that this is an off-label use for an unapproved indication, an off-label use of the product, the medication. Please note that the 3 criteria which are required for the high-level classification as off-label use are met. But for coding purposes, additional information is needed to finally code to an LLT under PT off-label use. Off-label use has to be explicitly mentioned in the verbatim or case in order to be able to code this information accordingly. Why? Off-label use refers to the unapproved use of an approved drug in a specific country. And this information is not available for coders in most instances because many coders are coding out of context. They do not have access to narratives or the full patient information. They may not even know the drug that was taken by the patient. So coders shouldn't take this decision unless off-label use is explicitly reported. Related guidance can be found in both the PTC document for MedDRA term selection and the PTC companion document. Now, finally, in the fourth scenario, Lisa suffers from forgetfulness due to the stress she is experiencing at her workplace. She also forgets that she has already taken her medication one day and takes it a second time. This is unintentional, accidental, but happens in the context of therapeutic use. So this scenario now represents a medication error. The following flowchart visualizes this decision-making process. Here are the core questions: intentional or accidental, caused by whom, triggered by whom, and in the context of therapeutic use, yes or no. Let us assume that the unapproved use took place intentionally. This may be decided by healthcare professionals or by patient or consumers. If this is a conscious decision by the healthcare professional and for therapeutic purposes, we classify these events as off-label use. These three criteria are required for the high-level classification as an off-label use. But remember, additional information is needed to finally code to an LLT under PT off-label use. Off-label use terms should only be selected when off-label use is specifically mentioned in the reported verbatim information. If an intentional deviation from the product information originates from the patient or consumer and happens in the therapeutic setting, we classify this as an intentional product misuse. And if the deviation does not occur within the therapeutic use of the product, the deviation is classified as either drug abuse or drug addiction, drug dependence. If the unapproved product use is unintentional, accidental, this can also be caused by both the healthcare professionals or patient consumers. If this occurs in the context of the therapeutic use of the relevant product, it is classified as a medication or product use error, device use error. You may now argue that in many cases, it is not clear whether such a deviation was intended or unintended. Here you can see one example for such a scenario. It is reported that the patient took an extra tablet before going to bed. If no further information is available, we do not know what the background was. Did the patient misunderstand the doctor's instructions or the package leaflet? This would then represent a medication error. Or did the doctor mistakenly give her the wrong schedule with a prescription? This would also represent a medication error, in this instance, a prescribing error. Or is the patient's discomfort getting worse at bedtime, and so she decided to take one more tablet? This scenario would constitute an intentional drug misuse. Or did the doctor decide to use the drug off-label because he was convinced that the treatment would be more effective this way? Our case information does not allow for any of these classifications. So what can be done when getting similar reports for coding purposes and when no further information can be obtained? Now, for coding such scenarios, MedDRA contains very vague, very general, non-specific PTs. if it's not clear whether an event happened by mistake or intentionally, a suitable LLT under the PT product use issue can be used. So a very general term. And if it is not clear whether an intentional deviation from proper use happens for therapeutic reasons, a suitable LLT under PT intentional product use issue can be selected. So these are the vague terms that you can use when you get a vague report, when you don't get further information and you cannot really classify specifically.
Carol-Ann, we've had a couple of questions. I think it would be good to cover at this point. A couple of our group have asked us, going back to that last slide, if the healthcare provider has prescribed it intentionally, but the words off-label use are not mentioned in the verbatim, are you saying that we would use that intentional product use issue for that scenario?
We will come to the examples later on and discuss it. Yeah.
Okay.
So the only thing to remember is that you should not, as a coder, if you code out of context, you should not just decide to code something to off-label use, because you may not know the country of origin of the report in pharmacovigilance. You're not familiar with the product. You're not a product expert. You do not know the differences in the local labels, so you're not able to really take this decision. And that's why regulators are really very clear on this point, that they don't want coders to classify such events as off-label use. You could, of course, then code it to an intentional. It's of course intentional. It's of course intentional, and depending on the stage where this occurs, whether this is just a prescription or whether it's actually administered, you would need to code to different PTs in order to capture the full information. We will come to this when talking about the principles of coding medication errors.
That's perfect. Thank you, Carol-Ann.
So we looked at this chart already, and we talked about these more vague terms that can be used when no full information is available for more specific classification. So the flow chart shown before is expanded here, and you see the 2 question marks here. And if you have a case, you don't get further information where you cannot say whether an intentional deviation from the product label was for therapeutic purposes, then you would use one of the LLTs under intentional product use issue. And if you do not have the information whether something of deviation really occurred intentionally or accidentally, then you would use a suitable LLT. You would select a suitable LLT under PT product use issue. So this is now the full classification flowchart. So both PTs are quite vague terms, but you will find other more specific terms in MedDRA for dose or schedule deviation, which are, so to speak, also neutral, because they do not contain the information accidental or intentional. They can be chosen in combination with other MedDRA terms for intentional misuse, off-label use, or medication errors, and they allow us to capture the details of what actually happened when no suitable combination term can be found in MedDRA. Like, for instance, extra dose administered doesn't contain the information whether this was accidental or intentional, or inappropriate schedule of product administration, incorrect dosage administered, incorrect dose administered, product administered to patient of inappropriate age, or product administration interrupted, or product dose omission issue. Again, a vague term, but more specific than the ones that we saw before. So in order to search for and select suitable MedDRA terms for verbatims that relate to unapproved product use, so deviation from the approved product information, the label, it is relevant to understand MedDRA structure and rules and the details of the PTC guidance documents. But it is also important to make yourself familiar with the MSSO MedDRA browsing tools or your own in-house MedDRA browsers. And I will now use the web-based browser to show you where to find the relevant terms and make you familiar with their hierarchy. So let me switch screens again and log into the MedDRA web-based browser with my credentials. Here we are, and this is how it looks like. And we will start with a top-down search in SOC injury. Here we are, SOC injury. And here we have the HLGT medication errors and other product use errors and issues at first. So in this HLGT, you find the accidental exposures to products, and then all the medication errors, all the medication error, product use error terms. Here, the NEC, the not elsewhere classified grouping, so rather vague terms. And here you will find the product use issue, for instance, that we saw before, this very vague term that can be used when it's not clear whether an event, an incident occurred accidentally or intentionally. And you see that underneath you have a lot of more specific LLTs that capture more specific information. Here, unapproved combination, unapproved schedule, unapproved age group, etc. Then you find some PTs like wrong dose, wrong drug, wrong rate, wrong route, wrong schedule. So PTs and LLTs that really capture the specifics of the deviation without containing any information about the stage where this specific deviation occurred. Then you have HLTs that represent the stages of the medication process, the product administration errors and issues, confusion errors and issues, dispensing, monitoring, preparation, prescribing, selection, storage, transcribing. So here under administration errors, you find a whole lot of PTs, very specific ones that, that can be used for coding these administration errors and issues. Here you have them, product dose omission and error, product dose omission issue, product administered by wrong person, very specific PTs. In some instances, because they are so specific, you may not really be sure how to distinguish the different concepts. And you may find some guidance here in the MedDRA concept descriptions. And if you look at you see here a definition of abuse, for instance, the definition, or it's not a definition, it's the way how the term is used and classified in MedDRA. Addiction is there, and of course also medication error. This is the definition that we saw before, and misuse for the purposes of term selection and analysis of MedDRA coded data. Misuse is the intentional use for therapeutic purpose by a patient or consumer of a product. And irrespective of the fact whether it's over-the-counter or prescription drug, other than prescribed or not in accordance with the authorized product information. So off-label use is also described here. And overdose, here we are, for the purposes of term selection and analysis of MedDRA coded data, overdose is more than the maximum recommended dose in quantity and or concentration, i.e. an excessive dose. And the same holds true for underdose. Let us look under underdose. For the purposes of term selection and analysis of MedDRA coded data, underdose is the administration of less than the minimum recommended dose in quantity or concentration. Just to show you the specificity here, we have two terms, dosage and dose, and you will find the respective PTs as well. Incorrect dosage administered and incorrect dose administered, for instance. Dosage refers to the determination and regulation of the size, frequency, and number of doses, so also the duration of therapy. So it's a much broader term than just the dose. A dose is a quantity to be administered at one time, such as a specified amount of medication. So be aware of these really small differences, and if you're not sure, either refer to these MedDRA concept descriptions. If you don't find a concept description, just do some research in the internet in order to really be sure about the descriptions of these terms, the definition of these terms, and how to distinguish them. So these were the medication errors and use issues. Of course, we have separate HLGTs for the off-label uses and intentional product misuses, use issues. Here we have the intentional product misuses. So conscious decision by patient or consumer for therapeutic purposes, here it is. And intentional product use issues, these are the more vague terms, intentional dose omission, intentional product use issue, intentional device use issue, and the off-label uses. Off-label use with some more specific terms underneath, and off-label use of device. We also have a separate HLGT for overdoses and underdoses not elsewhere classified. The accidental overdoses, of course, grouped under the administration errors. Here it is, accidental overdose and accidental underdose. But under this here, not elsewhere classified, you find the intentional overdose, the overdose, prescribed overdose, radiation overdose, and the same holds true for the underdoses. Now, what we are missing are the abuse and dependence terms, and these you find in psychiatric disorders. Under HLGT, psychiatric disorders, NEC, here we have the HLT, substance-related and addictive disorders. And under this HLT, you find the dependence terms, the very specific dependence terms, drug abuse, drug dependence antepartum, postpartum, etc., substance use disorders, tobacco abuse, etc. So this is the hierarchy of the terms. And if you're not familiar with the hierarchy and also the specifics of the PTs that you can find in the different HLTs, make yourself familiar with the different terms in order to use them specifically and consistently. So here, just a reminder of what we have just seen in the browser, the concept descriptions and the hierarchy of the relevant terms in the injury SOC and in the psychiatric SOC. What kind of terms can we find under HLGT, medication errors, and other product use errors and problems? We can find PTs for certain types of errors. I've showed you in the browser already, such as wrong drug, wrong patient, or wrong route. They can be selected together with, for example, PT prescribing error if no combination term is available. And terms that link an error to a stage in the medication use process, such as the prescribing stage. In addition, there are terms for intercepted errors, prevented by third-party intervention, so that they didn't reach the patient. An error occurred in a previous stage in the medication use process, but was intercepted from reaching the patient. MedDRA also contains two PTs that describe the possibility of an error or signal a circumstance that could potentially lead to a medical device use error or medication error, as well as vague PTs that I've already addressed, which can be used when it is unclear whether the reported incident was due to an error or happened intentionally, or when it is unclear whether an intentional deviation from the label by the patient or consumer occurred in the context of therapeutic use. Now it's your turn again. Based on what you have heard so far, and remember the concept description that I've shown you, how would you code this reported incident? Dose taken was below the minimum recommended dose in the product label. Can we consider this an underdose? Again, remember the concept description for underdose. Which LLT would you select for this verbatim? Underdose, accidental underdose, drug administration error, or incorrect dosage administered? Again, please recall the difference between dose and dosage. What would you do? Let's see what you're going for. The majority is voting for underdose, and that's perfectly correct. Drug administration error would be much too vague. Incorrect dosage would refer to dose, schedule, and duration of therapy. It's a more broader term, and we cannot say that this is an accidental overdose. It is not reported. It was not reported that this was unintentional. We are just told that an underdose was taken. So well done. Most of you got it right. Here we are. Next one. Here it is reported that the patient inadvertently took an excessive dose of the prescribed pills. How would you code this one? Would you select incorrect dose administered, overdose, accidental dose increase, or accidental overdose? What would you do? Again, please recall the definition of overdose, the concept description that we saw. Inadvertently took excessive dose of the prescribed pills. Well done, the majority got it right here. Let me close the poll. We know it was occurred accidentally, inadvertently, so we will have to choose a term that includes this information, like accidental dose increase or accidental overdose. And based on the definition that we saw before, an overdose is something that is beyond what is defined as the maximum dose in the label of the specific drug, i.e., this was the phrasing in the concept description, an excessive dose. It's exactly the same wording as we have in our verbatim here. Excessive dose would allow us to classify this dose as an overdose. So accidental overdose would be the correct assignment here. Any questions, Jane?
Well, on this recent one, how about overdose? What if the individual dose is fine, but the patient has pain and takes 8 instead of 2 tablets, for example, paracetamol in a day?
So first of all, the overdose really relates to a single dose, yeah, and or the concentration in the blood. So it really needs to be differentiated, and you have to know the label. So what is the maximum dose that is described in the label, both single dose or daily doses? And depending on what is defined in the label, you would either classify as overdose or an accidental dose increase or an intentional dose increase. So if the patient takes a drug more than it was actually prescribed, that is still in the framework what is covered in the label, then it would be an intentional dose increase. If it's beyond of what is defined in the label, it would be an intentional overdose. And it's because it's it's a conscious decision for therapeutic purposes, it would be a drug misuse, intentional drug misuse. Always recall the flow chart. First, classify the basic concept, whether it's a medication error, a misuse, off-label use, what app use, whatsoever, and then think about how to best capture the full information. And this sometimes is a product-specific decision. You have to know the actual dose range that is defined in the label.
Thank you, Carol.
Any further questions?
No, that's the, oh, hold on, there's one just popped in. If we're using CCDS as global database holders, but the local labs have differences, which do we go with in terms of determining dose, label, uses, etc.?
That's exactly the problem if you are working in a global database. It depends on your data entry conventions and your coding conventions, actually, what your reference would be. Usually, the local pharmacovigilance personnel is aware of the label, the local label, and should include this information in the narrative. And then the term extraction in pharmacovigilance would need to really capture this in the verbatim so that the coder then subsequently can code as specific as possible. The coder, him or herself, they are not able to really be aware of all the products and all the local labels and the differences that are there. They may even don't know the country of origin of the case of the ICSR. Okay. Any further questions?
That's all. Thank you, Caroline. No further questions. Thank you for answering those too.
Mm-hmm. So first, just a short reminder regarding the basic rule to be followed for coding with MedDRA. Of course, the quality of the reported information and the extraction of the relevant information during data entry are a basic requirement for good and meaningful coding. This was exactly the question that we had with a global label and local label and how to classify in coding. So the term extraction needs to be very specific in order to be able to code as specifically as possible. If the information received is vague or ambiguous, of poor quality, then ask for clarification. Coding is done on the LLT level, and the LLT that most accurately, most specifically reflects the reported incidents and events should always be selected. Nothing should be interpreted, added, and no relevant information should be omitted. And this is the basic rule, code as reported. And of course, only current LLTs should be used for coding purposes. I assume you are all very familiar with these basic rules, so I will not go into these any further. For coding product use errors and problems, the following tips may be helpful. First and foremost, you should be familiar with the MedDRA concept descriptions and the PTC guidances, the points to consider documents, the companion document, and the MedDRA term selection points to consider document, so that you know where to find more detailed information, more guidance to achieve accurate and consistent coding. You should also have a good knowledge of the MedDRA structure and hierarchy, particularly in SOC injury, poisoning, and procedural complications. Once you have found a potentially appropriate LLT and PT for the reported incident, check if the placement of the selected LLT or PT accurately reflects the reported event. This is a basic MedDRA coding rule. Always check the hierarchy if you're not sure. It is best to search the MedDRA hierarchy top-down when coding medication errors and other product use concepts, unless you are already very experienced in coding such incidents. And finally, if you cannot find a specific term for drugs, vaccines, or medical devices, look out for a product term, a more vague term that would cover all these medicinal products. that would be suitable for your coding task in order to capture the incident as specifically as possible. The companion document specifies some principles for coding medication and other product use errors, like when to use the PT medication error, when to select more than one term, when to use the PT off-label use, how to capture potential and intercepted medication errors, how to capture both the specific type of error and the stage of the medication use system where the error occurred, when to capture the root cause for medication errors, and that we should not infer a medication error. And I will address them one by one now. The first principle refers to the use of PT medication error. As coders, we should not use this term unless we have no further information reported in the case. If you have further information, then search the hierarchy under HLGT medication errors and other product use errors and issues that I have shown you before in SOC injury, and select the most specific LLT that you can find. And if a specific error is reported, but no suitable term can be found, then please submit a change request to get a better term and assign the LLT that represents the best approximation to the reported incident as a placeholder. Here an example. If it is only reported that the patient inadvertently didn't use the medication as prescribed and no further information is available, then of course LLT medication error can be selected, which is grouped under the same PT medication error. Sometimes you will get a report of a chain of events where an initial error leads to additional subsequent errors or even adverse events in the patient. Then code the initial error as the priority, and all subsequent errors and adverse events have to be coded in addition as reported. But please do not use multiple LLTs to represent one singular incident that is reported with both a general and a specific description in the reported term, the verbatim. This is in line with the general rule for coding of combination terms that refer to a general medical disorder that is further specified. As an example, if an arrhythmia is reported that is specified as atrial fibrillation in the given verbatim, one would only code the atrial fibrillation in order to capture the most specific information. The same holds true for medication errors and other medication use concepts. Again, an example for this principle, it is reported that a nurse miscalculated the dose and the patient received 40 milligram instead of 20 milligram of his medication. He experienced severe hypotension. We would capture the initial error with the LLT dose calculation error plus the subsequent administration error with the LLT incorrect dose administered, and of course also the resulting adverse event in the patient, the hypotension. It is a chain of events starting with the dose calculation error that leads to an administration of error, the administration of an incorrect dose, and finally to an adverse reaction in the patient, a hypotension. Are there any questions, Jane, so far?
No, nothing new, Carol-Ann. Just there's a lot of interest around off-label use, so that's where most of our questions are coming.
So here we are with the off-label use. Always consider the criteria and information required to select a term under the PT off-label use. Off-label use relates to situations where a healthcare professional intentionally prescribes, dispenses, or recommends a product for a medical purpose that is, this is not in accordance with the authorized product information. It has to be an HCP, it has to be intentional and for a medical purpose in the context of therapeutic use. So these are the criteria that must be met for the high-level classification. And the highlighted sentence added in the latest version of the MedDRA term selection points to consider document, this is copied from the points to consider companion document. And it was added in the latest version of the MedDRA term selection document. As a coder, off-label use terms should only be selected when off-label use is specifically mentioned in the reported verbatim information. So coders should not take this decision when only the 3 criteria are met, because it needs more specific product knowledge and information about the country of origin of the reported case. Local regulations and the product information may differ between regulatory regions, and coders do not have this information. So regulators, as mentioned before, are very clear on this, and you'll see that in all examples for off-label use in the points to consider document, in both PTC documents, the off-label use is clearly named in the wording. Let us look at an example. It is reported that a pediatrician decided to use COVID-19 vaccine off-label for his 10-year-old high-risk patient, although not yet approved for this age group. So does this verbatim fulfill the criteria for classification as off-label use? And is off-label use explicitly mentioned? HCP has caused the deviation. It was a pediatrician. He did it intentionally. He decided to do so, and based on therapeutic considerations. He wanted to protect his 10-year-old patient from an infection. And we are told that he decided to use the COVID-19 vaccine off-label, meaning that the vaccine is approved for prophylaxis of COVID-19 in the respective country, but not for this age group. The most specific LLT for this scenario is LLT off-label use in unapproved age group under PT off-label use. Questions?
Yeah,
Jane.
The questions that is coming up is, what if we know from your decision tree, the high-level concept, that it is off-label use, but what if the words are not present in the verbatim? What would we code that to? We're getting comments saying that it's rarely reported with those exact words in the verbatim and from their experience. So what would you code it to if it doesn't have those exact words in the verbatim term?
It's a difficult question, and it really depends on the processes in your the data entry conventions, the processes in the case processing, how the case processing in your organization is organized, and whether this is a global pharmacovigilance organization. So usually, if you have a global pharmacovigilance organization, the local PV personnel should ensure that the information off-label use is contained in the narrative or even extracted accordingly in the description of the incident. Because if you as coder, you are coding out of context, you have no access to the full case information in most instances, then you are not able to really take the decision whether something was off-label, because you don't know the local label, you even don't know the country of origin of the report. So you cannot take the decision off-label use unless you have this information somewhere in the database, somewhere in the verbatim. Out of context, you should not do that. It's different if you have a local country-specific PV organization. You are only processing German cases or French cases or Spanish cases, for instance, only for the country Spain. And when you have access, when you have the information about the product in question, When you have access to the label, then you may be allowed to really classify something as off-label use because you have the access to this information. But this needs to be described in your processes, in the data entry conventions, in the whole workflow. Often the classification off-label use is done at the end of the case processing case processing by the product experts, because the product experts, they have, of course, an overview about the differences in the local labels for their respective product. So responsibilities need to be defined based on the access to the information that is needed for coding to off-label use. As I said, the 3 criteria, they really define the rough classification, not for coding purposes, just a rough classification, but for coding purposes, additional information is needed. If you have this additional information and it is made sure that you have access to the local label, you exactly know where the case comes from, then you may be allowed as a coder to take the decision, but only if you have this information. Otherwise, you should not do so. Somebody else needs to be responsible for taking the decision whether something is true off-label use, yes or no, because it depends on local regulations and it depends on the local label.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you. That's a really hot topic at the moment for our group. A couple of other questions have come in asking about other terms and the difference between other terms. I think it might be useful for all the group to say, what's the difference between off-label use and product use for unapproved indication? Or how about using drug effective or drug ineffective for unapproved indication?
So drug effective for unapproved indication, if you have the information that an indication is unapproved and a drug is used for this unapproved indication, and you have the information that it was not effective, then you would code to this term. So this needs to be explicitly reported. If you don't know whether you cannot just select, you need this information that it is an unapproved indication in the verbatim. Otherwise, you would not be able to select this LLT. Again, because you need the information whether the respective indication, whether this for this specific drug is approved in a specific country. It's the same problem with the off-label use, similar. And regarding the intentional use for unapproved indication, we will come to this because I will have an example later on where we really will distinguish these different terms from the terms under off-label use.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Caroline. Just check nothing news just popped in. No, that's all so far. Thank you very much for that explanation.
Yeah. The principle number 4 now refers to potential medication errors. Such incidents should also be captured, and MedDRA has 2 PTs for doing so. LLT and PT circumstance or information capable of leading to medication error, and LLT and PT circumstance or information capable of leading to device use error. And MedDRA terms that help capturing the contributing factors should also be selected, like for instance, LLT drug label lookalike. Why do some regulators want to receive this information, are actually very keen to receive such information? Well, in such scenarios, no medication error happened yet, but could, of course, occur in the near future based on the reported contributing factors like drug name confusion, etc. When understanding the background for these potential errors, regulators can take steps to prevent errors even before happening. So depending on your local requirements, Do not omit such information, but capture all relevant information when receiving similar verbatims and code both the potential for an error by selecting one of these PTs and also code the contributing factor or factors. Here again an example for this principle. A pharmacist reported that the blurred print on the drug label could lead to a wrong dose being given. No medication error occurred yet, but the pharmacist saw a circumstance, the blurred print on the label, that could lead to errors in the future. So remember, we would code the potential error by selecting circumstance or information capable of leading to medication error, same PT, and we would also code the contributing scenario, the root cause that could lead to a medication error. Here, the blurred print on the label by selecting LLT product label text illegible under product label issue. Be aware that we would not code the type of potential medication error in addition by assigning LLT wrong dose. That would convey that a medication error actually happened. And here only the potential for a medication error is reported, together with the root cause. Next principle. Sometimes medication errors at an earlier stage of the medication use process are prevented from reaching the patient. So a medication error occurred during prescription, preparation of the medication, or at another stage, but it is detected and intercepted by an active intervention of an additional person. When such scenarios are reported, the selected term for the intercepted error should represent the stage where the error actually occurred, not where it was prevented. Meaning that when it is reported that a pharmacist dispensed the wrong drug, but the nurse identified the error before giving it to the patient, we would select LLT intercepted drug dispensing error, under PT intercepted product dispensing error, capturing the stage where the error actually occurred, and we would not code to LLT intercepted administration error because the nurse did nothing wrong. The error occurred at the dispensing stage. Any questions, any related questions to the last two principles, Jane?
No, I don't think so. Just a comment that you might want to weave in. Can one report contain a medication error and also a potential medication error in a single report?
Yes, of course.
And then that was what I replied as well. How to understand intercepted drug administration error when it doesn't reach the patient? Is that one that you'll go, this is what we're on now. How to understand intercepted drug administration when it doesn't reach the patient, when it cannot reach the patient.
So intercepted means that a medication error occurred at some earlier stage in the medication use process, but it was intercepted from reaching the patient. So finally, it was not administered.
Thank you, Caroline. That's all the questions we have so far.
We already talked about the stages of the medication use system and looking into the HLGT medication errors and other product use errors and issues and the MedDRA hierarchy underneath. This slide now shows the different stages, starting with the storage of the products, prescribing stage, transcribing, preparation, dispensing stage, administration stage, and the monitoring stage. One of the principal MedDRA coding rules, code as specifically as possible, capturing the full information of what has been reported, also applies to coding of medication errors, meaning that if a specific error is reported that occurred at a specific stage of the medication process, we should capture the full information, the type of error, and the stage where the error occurred. You'll see that MedDRA contains many terms that capture both the type of error and the stage, like, for instance, LLT, wrong drug prescribed. Others only capture the type of error, like LLT wrong drug or LLT wrong dose. So if the stage where this error occurred is unknown, you can just select the LLTs for the type of error. And others capture the stage only, like LLT drug prescribing error or LLT drug dispensing error. Again, if the error is not specified, you would just select an LLT to capture the stage where the error occurred. So always capture both the stage and the type of error where it is known. And if the stage is not known, capture the type of error only. And if the error, the specific error is not known, but the stage is known, then capture the stage only. When both the stage and the type of error are reported, you would look for a combination term first in MedDRA and use a single LLT to capture the full information whenever possible. As shown in the first example, when it is reported that the pharmacy dispensed the wrong drug, the LLT wrong drug dispensed would capture the full information. There is no need to assign two codes like LLT wrong drug and LLT drug dispensing error. No split coding is needed here because we have a perfect combination term. But sometimes you may not find a suitable combination term. If it is reported that the doctor mistakenly prescribed the wrong drug strength, you would have to split to capture the reported information in full by assigning wrong strength. So with this, you would capture the specific error and LLT drug prescribing error in order to capture the stage where this error occurred. Next one. We already shortly addressed the root causes when talking about potential medication errors. So if a medication error is reported in conjunction with the actual cause of this error, then always select a term for the root cause plus the resulting error. Remember what we discussed earlier. Root causes are critical to understand why an error occurred and to identify interventions that can be undertaken to prevent the error. And that is why regulators are very interested in obtaining information about these root causes. The next example describes such a case. A doctor wrote a prescription for 40 milligrams of drug X for angina every 6 hours. But because of the illegibility of the prescription, the nurse administered the same dose of drug Y, a calcium channel blocker used in the treatment of hypertension, for which the maximum daily dose is only 10 milligrams. So because of the error made, the patient received 160 milligrams of this calcium channel blocker per day, 4 times 40 milligrams. And remember, the maximum daily dose is only 10 milligrams. And a day after taking the first 4 overdoses of the calcium channel blocker, the patient suffered a heart attack and died. So what needs to be captured here? At first, the underlying disease and the indication for use, the angina pectoris, so either medical history or indication for use. Then the illegible written prescription, the resulting medication error, the administration of the wrong drug, and the accidental overdose, and the resulting adverse reaction in the patient, the heart attack. And remember, it is very important to capture the root cause here if reported. Any questions, Jane, for these principles?
No questions on these principles, Caroline. No.
Okay. Then let's continue in the interest of time here. The next slide shows the last principle that we will discuss today. Do not infer a medication error. Remember another basic rule for coding with MedDRA. Code as reported. Do not add or subtract relevant medical information. The same rule also applies to the coding of medication errors. If you receive a verbatim that describes a deviation from the label, an unauthorized use of the product, only select an LLT or LLTs that reflect what has been reported. Do not assume that a medication or device use error occurred if this is not made clear in the verbatim. So if it is reported that a nurse administered 50 milligrams of drug X, do not assume that this is a medication error. Try to obtain more information from the reporter or find out the dose range referencing the prescribing information of the respective drug. But do not assume a medication error when you get such vague verbatims. And as a summary here, a nice visual presentation of the different types of medication error cases taken from the good practice guide of the EMA. In the first example, a medication error occurs leading to an administration error and to harm in the patient. Next, an error happens and reaches the patient, but it does not result in any harm to the patient. The third type of report refers to an intercepted medication error, where an error occurs, but it does, in the medication use process, but it is prevented from reaching the patient. So this would be an intercepted error. And finally, a potential error is described, where it is reported that there is a risk for a medication error in the product use process due to special circumstances, a special root cause, like drug name confusion or drug packaging confusion or drug appearance confusion. So no error occurred yet, it didn't reach the patient, no harm. Any questions before starting with the coding demonstrations?
No, let me just, one's just come in. What if a laboratory worker, not a nurse or doctor, while manipulating a product, accidentally splashes their face, washes it with soap and water? When scrubbing the face, epistaxis occurred. So is it nurses and doctors, or could it be a laboratory worker?
So this scenario describes a completely different concept. It's an accidental exposure. It's not a medication error. So this was not, it was an accidental exposure to the product in the preparation process. So it's not a medication error, not a use issue.
Thank you. Are there any general rules for assessing the relatedness or expectedness for medication errors?
Oh, this is something that goes beyond the coding topic and may really depend on your in-house conventions and also regulatory requirements that may differ between regions and countries. So nothing I could say in this regard.
There's a comment that in a clinical trial only AEs or SAEs are coded. The potential errors would not be reported in CRFs, and so there would be no AE. I think that's just a comment to share with the group.
Yeah.
If you have, well, okay, I think that's, and then the question from Natalie is, how should these be captured? So these, if you've got a clinical trial and you're not coding the potential errors, are these captured at all in a clinical trial setting? I don't think.
I think this rather refers to the, I've been working in clinical development as well as in pharmacovigilance for many, many years. I never saw something in clinical studies like this, but I saw overdoses, for instance. So there needs to be a definition what is to be considered an overdose in clinical studies, and also some other administration errors by investigators or study nurses. But I never saw circumstances with the potential of leading to medication errors, because usually you need a product name, you need a packaging, etc., etc. I never saw that. But if something like that should happen, so maybe I don't recall. I was attending this webinar that I mentioned before of the FDA and the Reagan-Udall Foundation. That refers to product containers in clinical studies and how they could lead to medication errors. This would be a circumstance that could lead to a medication error in the respective study. So maybe this would be of interest for you to watch this recording of this event, and also or to watch the slides. They are also posted.
Thank you, Caroline. I think that depends on your internal processes too, doesn't it, about how something's captured.
Yeah.
Just a final one here. So there's a question about the indication. If there's if there's only one indication for the drug worldwide, would you code it if there was another indication mentioned and you knew that there was only one indication that was approved? Would you then take it as being unapproved?
Yeah, it's really a product-specific decision. If this is the case, yeah, then you could, of course, say, well, this is an unapproved indication, of course.
And that when you're sorry, thank you.
But you would need, as a coder, you would need to know the product, and you would need to know that this product has the same indication worldwide. So again, this would require some additional information on the coder's end.
So thank you, Caroline. When you're next in the browser, can you show the concept descriptions again for the overdose? Just a comment there. And then there's a question on example 6 with the root cause illegible prescription. Why did you code angina when it was not an event reported in the case? That was
the patient was treated for angina, so it must have been a medical history condition, and it was continuing. That's why I said it's either the indication for use. It was the indication for use for the product, and it should have been captured as medical history term. It's not an adverse event in the patient itself. If there was no aggravation.
Okay, that's everything. The big rush there. Thank you for that.
Yeah. So let's continue to really get through our demonstrations now. So if you are confronted, if you're coding such scenarios, you will have to assess the reported information. And at first, you would check for the 3 criteria for the classification. Did the incident occur intentionally or unintentionally? Who caused it? And was there therapeutic purpose? Then you would check at which stage the error occurred and whether it led to subsequent errors and even harm in the patient. If contributing factors are reported, they need to be captured in addition. Or was the report referring to circumstances that could lead to a medication error? Or was the error intercepted before reaching the patient? Because the type of report, the type of information that you get will influence the way you search for appropriate terms. It will help you find the most suitable LLTs, the closest matches for the reported incidents. And here's our first example. It is reported that the nurse forgot to administer the second of 2 chemotherapy treatments to the patient. So what can we take from this report? It is reported that it was accidental. Yeah, we know that. Do we know who caused it? Yes, an HCP, a nurse. And was it in the framework of therapeutic use of the product? Yes, it was. We also know the stage where the error occurred, but no root cause was provided. So how would you approach this report now? Which LLT would you select? Nurse forgot to administer the second of 2 chemotherapy treatments to the patient. Scheduled daily dosing taken less frequently, drug dose omission in error, drug use for unapproved schedule, or temporary interruption of therapy. Let's see what you're going for. Drug dose omission in error. Well done. Yes. I see some of you are also going for the schedule terms, but it's really only 1 dose that was omitted here by the nurse in error, and this needs to be captured. So let me close the poll. Here we are, and apply our decision chart. We know that the incident occurred in error. We know it was caused by the nurse. And we know that this is or has occurred in the framework of therapeutic use of the product, so the incident has to be classified as medication error. Now let us look into the browser again in order to check for these terms. If we go again into the SOC injury, here we are. The first, here we are. Here we have the product administration errors and issues. And here we have the product dose omission in error and product dose omission issue. So here the accidental nature is captured. Here we have the vague term that you can use if you don't know whether something occurred intentionally or accidentally. And drug dose omission in error would capture our reported incident in the most specific way. So inappropriate schedule of product administration is another. Here it is, inappropriate schedule of product administration with many LLTs underneath. This would be selected when it is reported that dose omissions occur regularly, take place more often, like when a patient takes a once daily dose less frequently. Drug use for unapproved schedule. Is a different LLT. Here we are, right mouse click, go to browser, click on the LLT, and then you will be able to see it in the hierarchy. Here it is, drug use for unapproved schedule is grouped under product use issue. So a very vague term where you wouldn't capture the fact that the drug was administered. So it's a product use issue term. Therapy interruption was the other option. Oops, typo. Here we are. Therapy interrupted, go to browser. You see it's grouped under surgical and medical procedures. And we have two LLTs underneath, one that is identical to the PT and temporary interruption of therapy. So LLTs under this PT should only be used when a therapy was interrupted due to reasons that are out of the control of the HCP or patient consumer, like supply issues, insurance issue, financial issues, when the patient cannot afford the medication, etc. So only then you should use these terms. Let me switch back to my slides now. And here again, a reminder of what we just saw. So the most specific code assignment would be drug dose omission in error. And here we are under PT product dose omission in error. Other questions, Jane?
No, nothing new, Caroline.
Next one. Here it is reported that the patient did not read instructions thoroughly and took drug X for prophylaxis instead of treatment of the approved indication. So they took it for the right indication, but not for treatment, but for prophylaxis of a disease. So what do we know based on the information provided? Is it reported whether it was accidental or intentional? Yes, we know that the incident happened accidentally. The patient did not read the instructions thoroughly enough. Do we know who caused it? Yes, the patient. And was it in the framework of therapeutic use of the product? Yes, it was. We also know the stage where the error occurred. The drug was administered, but no root cause was provided. So how would you approach this reported incident now? Would you select LLT, drug use for unapproved indication, unintentional use for unapproved indication, product leaflet instructions confusion, off-label use in unapproved indication, and/or drug administration errors? Split coding may also be an option here. What would you do? Remember, we should always try to capture the full information of the reported incident. Let's see what you're going. Unintentional use for unapproved indication. product leaflet instruction confusion, or drug administration error are the favorites here. So let me close the poll and first use our decision chart again to classify the incident first. We know the incident happened accidentally. Here we are. We know that it was caused by the patient, and we know that it was in the context of therapeutic use. So meaning that this verbatim describes a medication error. Now let me search in the browser again for the relevant terms, and we know it was administered for an unapproved indication for prophylaxis of a disease instead of treatment of the respective disease. So admin and indication. Let's see if we find something. Contraindicated drug administered, no, these do not fit. So what about indication and use? Device use, drug use for unapproved indication, intentional use for unlabeled indication, unintentional use for unapproved indication. So this one would fit because we know that it is an accidental incident, and here drug use for unapproved indication would capture the fact that the drug was used for an unapproved indication, but without the information that it was accidental. So these two do not capture the full information because we know that this drug was finally administered. These terms just are use terms. So if I go to the browser, you see that they are grouped under medication errors, product use errors and issues, NEC. They are not grouped under the product administration errors and issues, HLT. So somehow we will have to capture that the drug was administered for an unapproved indication in error. So we would need to capture the drug administration in addition. We know it was an error, so here drug administration error, here we are. And if I go to the browser, here we are, product administration error. So we saw that we didn't find any more specific term that would capture the fact that the drug was finally administered, plus the specifics of the error, that it was for an unapproved indication. So here split coding would be necessary. And product leaflet instructions confusion was one option, and some of you voted for this term. But you see here the product confusion errors and issues are grouped under this HLT. Here you find the product label confusion and product leaflet confusion as well. But this would be incorrect because would not be appropriate because nothing was wrong with the label. The patient just did not read the label thoroughly enough. It was not reported that the label itself was confusing. So this would be an interpretation. And off-label use and unapproved indication is of course incorrect because this was all triggered by the patient and it was accidental. So based on our decision chart, this would be absolutely incorrect. So let me go to the, oops, my slides back. Here we are. And here we have the drug administration error that needs to be captured. And then the two options, drug use for unapproved indication and unintentional use for unapproved indication, both grouped under this NEC grouping here. Unintentional use for unapproved indication would capture the accidental nature. You could, of course, also argue that the accidental nature is already captured with the drug administration error, so that drug use for unapproved indication would suffice. But I would always try to code as specifically as possible and select the unintentional use for unapproved indication plus the drug administration error. So here we are. The final proposal is to code to drug administration error under PT product administration error and LLT unintentional use for unapproved indication, same PT. Any questions?
No, Caroline. No questions.
Okay. Here we have the next one. Patient took more than the prescribed dose to get a better drug effect. Let's look at the verbatim and answer the relevant questions again. So we know that it was intentional. Yeah. We know who has caused the incident. It was a patient. We know it was for therapeutic purposes. The patient wanted to get a better drug effect. And we also know the stage in the medication practice where the incident occurred, because the patient took more than the prescribed dose to get a better drug effect, and no root cause was provided. So your turn again. Which LLT would you select here? Unapproved dose administered, intentional overdose, wrong dose administered, intentional misuse by dose change, incorrect dosage administered. What would you do? Patient took more than the prescribed dose to get a better drug effect. Intentional by the patient for therapeutic purposes. Let's see what you're going for. Intentional misuse by dose change is favored solution. Well done. Intentional overdose would be one option, but it's of course not specific enough. You would not capture the fact that this was triggered by the patient and that it was intentional. So you wouldn't capture the basic concept with this. And also overdose. I will show the concept description of overdose again. Patient took more than the prescribed dose. It could well be that even if you took more than the prescribed dose, it could still be in the dose range that is defined in the label. So it must not have been an overdose. It would again be an interpretation. Intentional misuse by dose change would be the best code assignment here. Here we are. Most of you have voted for this LLT, so well done. And again, let's use our decision chart. We know it was intentional. It was triggered by the patient. It was for therapeutic reasons. The patient wanted to get a better drug effect. So we should select a term under the intentional product misuse options that is as specific as possible. Let me again, where is my browser? Here it is. So let's do a top-down search in SOC injury here, and let me collapse everything. Here we are. Here we are. So we would look into off-label uses and intentional product misuses use issues. And we said, based on our decision chart, what we have here is a concept that relates to the intentional product misuse. Here we have this PT, and let's look for the most specific LLT that we can find, and this would be intentional misuse by dose change. Dose was changed. There's no more specific term that would really capture the dose increase, so there is no term that would say intentional misuse by dose increase or dose decrease, but dose change at least captures the basic medical concept. So the other option was intentional overdose, and this can be found here under overdoses. Here it is, intentional overdose. But as I mentioned before, this would be inappropriate because it would be an interpretation. The dose increase could still have been in the range of what is allowed based on the label. And all other options that were offered in this quiz were incorrect because unapproved dose administered, incorrect dose administered, and incorrect dosage administered do not represent intentional drug misuse, but drug administration errors or issues. And we know it was an intentional deviation by the patient for therapeutic purposes. So here the MedDRA concept descriptions again, the question before. So if you click on this icon here, MedDRA concept descriptions, here they are, and they are sorted alphabetically. And if I look for overdose, here's a concept description. For the purposes of term selection and analysis of MedDRA coded data, overdose is more than the maximum recommended dose in quantity and or concentration, i.e. an excessive dose. And you will find many other concept descriptions here in alphabetical order as well. So here we are. Let me go back to my slides. And here we have our options of the PAL. Unapproved dose administered is grouped under product use issue. So this would not be correct. Incorrect dosage administered does not represent an intentional misuse concept either. It is grouped under PT incorrect dose administered and or dosage administered. And so you would need to differentiate between dose and dosage. I mentioned this before. Dosage is broader, refers to not only a single dose, but also to schedule and duration, whereas the dose is defined as a single dose. And intentional overdose would be inappropriate because more information about the drug and the labeled dose range would be needed to classify as intentional overdose. So the correct code assignment here is intentional misuse by dose change. Here we are under PT, intentional product misuse. Questions, Jane?
Yes, we do have some questions, Caroline. Do you want to take them? So would you also hear code extra dose administered? Would you also take that? Because you said you've changed the dose, but would you also take an
extra dose? We don't know. Patient took more than the prescribed dose to get a better drug effect. We don't know whether it was two tablets at a time or whether the daily dose was increased by taking 2 tablets instead of 1 in the morning and evening, for instance. We don't know that. So that's why I would just say intentional misuse by dose change.
Okay, so with this LLT, would you also use this LLT if the patient cut transdermal patches in half, say?
Well, this is if this is of course not allowed. So this would be an inappropriate technique in product usage process at first, and then it would of course be. It depends if it's because of what the context is. If it's just that the patient was afraid of any side effects of the drug contained in the patch of this combination product, and then cut the patch, then it would be an intentional deviation. And of course it's unapproved, so it's an inappropriate technique as well of product usage. And I would of course then also say it's an accidental or not accidental, it's an intentional deviation from the dose regimen. Yeah. So the dose that is provided by the patch is of course then smaller than what was intended.
Okay, so and then we've got a couple of other slightly different scenarios. So I don't know if you want to take them or if you want to move on in the interest of time.
Yeah, I would like to move on because we had some question related to off-label use. And here comes now the example with the off-label use and the different options that can be, that are possible, not correct, but possible when assigning codes here. So in this example, it is reported that the doctor prescribed drug A off-label for suppression of preterm labor after careful risk-benefit assessment. So what do we know here? We know that it was intentional. It was a conscious decision. We know it was triggered by a doctor, an HCP. It was in the framework of therapeutic use. So all criteria for classification of the incident as off-label use are met. And it is also reported that the doctor used the drug off-label. So we have this information in the verbatim, that it's not covered by the local label. We also know the stage where the issue occurred. It's the stage of drug was prescribed off-label for a patient suffering preterm labor, but no root cause was provided. So which LLT would you select when looking at this reported incident? Drug use for unapproved indication, drug prescribing error, drug prescribed for unapproved indication, off-label use in unapproved indication, or intentional use for unlabeled indication. Let's have a look. Yes, most of you are going in the correct direction. Off-label use in unapproved indication. Drug prescribed for unapproved indication would not capture the intentional nature here. It could also be an accidental background. Intentional use for unlabeled indication would capture the fact that it is an intentional deviation, but it could also happen because a patient consumer decides to use a product for an unlabeled indication. So off-label use in unapproved indication is the most specific term that we can assign in this instance. Let me close the poll here. And we have the information in the verbatim that is off-label, so that it's not covered by the label. It's an authorized product in that country, but not for this indication. And that's why off-label use in unapproved indication would be the correct assignment. Here again, our decision chart, we know it's intentional. We know it was caused, or it was a conscious decision by a doctor for therapeutic intention, so off-label use. And we know, we are told that it's off-label use. So we have the information that it is not covered by the local label. It's specifically mentioned. So that's why we can classify this incident as an off-label use. So again, here's our, so if I go for off-label use, again, under the intentional off-label uses and intentional product misuses, use issues, HLGT, here we have a separate HLT for the off-label uses, off-label use of device. And here we have different, more specific LLTs underneath. And we also have, we have the off-label use in unapproved indication. So this would perfectly cover the reported incident here. And if we look at the other terms that were proposed, drug use for unapproved indication is under product use in unapproved indication. This would not capture the fact that it was an intentional, a conscious decision by a doctor, and that it was off-label. Drug prescribing error, this was not reported. It was a conscious decision. Drug prescribed for unapproved indication is a vague term. It could relate to an accidental deviation with a prescription or an intentional one. So this is again a product prescribing issue term. Intentional use for unlabeled indication, This would be an option if you don't know whether it was really an off-label prescription. Then you could consider the intentional use for unlabeled indication. But here it was explicitly reported that the drug was prescribed off-label, and that's why off-label use in unapproved indication is the best and most specific code assignment here. Here we are, LLT off-label use in unapproved indication under PT off-label use. I hope I could answer your question, because we had this question before about these unapproved indication LLTs, when to use them. Any further questions, Jane?
We've had a few questions around the use of a drug versus the administration of a drug. If you know that it was prescribed off-label, but you don't know if it was administered, does that still count as off-label? We've had this a few times, so you might want to address it.
Yeah, so it is off-label. Yeah, it's an off-label use in an unapproved indication. So here it would completely be sufficient to code this to off-label use in unapproved indication. Usually, if you're confronted with any deviations from schedule, other deviations, not off-label use, from schedule or dosage whatsoever, then you would clearly differentiate between use and administration, because use could be anything, could relate to any stage in the medication use process. Whereas the other more specific terms, like the administration terms, the prescribing terms, the preparation terms, the dispensing terms, these are really capturing the specific stages in the medication use process. So as mentioned before with the principle, you would always try to capture the stage where an error or an issue or a deviation from the unapproved, from the approved product information takes place.
I think that's it for now, Caroline. I think move on and we'll see what we're left with at the end, time-wise.
So this is the last one here. Doctor mixed up the drug names because they look similar and prescribed the wrong medication. So here we know that it was accidental. The doctor mixed up the drug names. It was an accidental event. It was caused by the doctor in the framework of therapeutic use, and it was at the prescribing stage. And here a root cause was reported for this error. So what would you do with this one? Doctor mixed up the drug names because they look similar and prescribed the wrong medication. Wrong drug administered, wrong drug prescribed, wrong drug, product confusion, drug name lookalike, drug prescription issue. What would you select? Wrong drug prescribed and drug name lookalike are the most specific terms that we select. Well done. Yeah. Product confusion is too unspecific. It's more vague. Drug name lookalike really captures what has been reported more specifically. And drug prescription issue is too vague. We know it was the doctor mixed up the drug names, so it was an error. And wrong drug prescribed captures the error, whereas drug prescription issue does is too vague. With the wrong drug prescribed, we perfectly capture what has been reported here, that a wrong medication was prescribed. Well done. And again here, our chart, it was an accidental deviation from the label. It was triggered by the doctor in this instance. In the framework of therapeutic use, it was a medication error. And when going to the browser here, if I enter wrong drug, here we are, and search, I can one direct hit, but I'm looking for a prescribing term. Here it is, wrong drug prescribed. Perfectly captured what has been reported here. Product prescribing error is the PT. And now what about the root cause? So there was a confusion. We know that in the medication errors and other product use errors and issues, we have this HLT, product confusion errors and issues. And here we have product name confusion, and we have sound alike, look alike. In this instance, we know that it looked alike, so this would be the most specific term to capture the root cause. And you see that there are also PTs for product packaging confusion, use of error-prone abbreviation, product label confusion, product dose confusion, etc. So here we are. You would code to wrong drug prescribed under product prescribing error and drug name look-alike under product name confusion in order to capture the root cause. Any related questions, Jane?
No, nothing related to this at the moment, Caroline.
So this is a summary of what we just discussed today. I will not go into this any further. And now we come to the last option for you to raise questions.
Yes, so we've got, there was a question about somebody reports something that's a possible medication error or wrong dose because they think the device maybe didn't give the full dose, or they think there's a problem, so it's possible. Can you give us some guidance on these? Do we code them as if it was a medication error if we can't follow up?
Usually you would go worst case in pharmacovigilance, but this may also depend on internal decisions.
Okay, thank you, Caroline. That's good. Let me just bear with me while I just go back. There are a couple that I said if we've got if dose refers to a single dose and dosage refers to the schedule, if the patient unintentionally misses several doses in a row, for example, if the device is broken, is there a better way to capture the fact than just missed dose? So if several doses are missed.
Yeah, that's a problem that I was also confronted with. So this is something that I would define in the internal coding conventions, how to handle this in order to ensure consistency of handling these terms. You could do both. You could either consider this a schedule issue, or you could consider this dose omissions. There is no dose omissions terms in MedDRA. So we, at my previous life at pharma, we decided to code this to schedule issues because it's not a single dose omission. You may decide from which, if 3 doses are missed or if 10 doses are missed. And it will also depend on the circumstances that are reported. So if 10 doses were omitted because of a surgical intervention, for instance, so an anticoagulant had to be stopped because of a surgical intervention, then this would not represent a medication error or intentional drug misuse or whatsoever. This would be a temporary interruption of therapy for medical reasons. So this cannot be answered with a yes or no, but really depends on the specific case.
Thank you for that. I think that's everything. There was a question about the difference between drug effective for unapproved indication, the difference between that term and unexpected therapeutic benefit, but that doesn't relate to medication errors, so you may not want.
No, it does not relate to medication error. Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think that's everything, Caroline. We can check through the list afterwards. If there's anything that you wanted to raise that's we've not managed to address it, you can email us separately and we will check through the list to make sure that we've covered everything. There were a lot of questions today.
Yes. So these are some useful information where how you can contact the MSSO, also the training schedule, and again a link to the MedDRA support documentation and how to submit change requests here. These are coming webinars. This was one that was provided yesterday. I just left it in my screenshot in order to show you that this medication era webinar is offered in different languages, so in Russian, in Spanish, Korean, and in French. So this is the one that we have today here. And you also have the option to contact the MSSO via different channels, different media. And what I wanted to show you is, here we are again in the...
Can you share the concept descriptions before you go as well, please?
The concept descriptions, here they are. Yeah, here they are. So you find them in the browser, MedDRA concept descriptions. You also find them in the MedDRA introductory guide in the appendix. But here it's the easiest way to find them in the MSSO MedDRA browser.
Thank you.
Yeah, so here we are on the MedDRA website, contact. This is the page, and you see we have a YouTube channel. And what I wanted to show you, if you are interested in more information about medication errors, then you can watch these recorded sessions. These are workshops on medication errors where you will find more examples that we have discussed in these workshops. And as Jane mentioned, by the end of this week or beginning of next week, you will find the recorded session, today's recorded session, on this YouTube channel as well, provided that we didn't face any technical issues with the recording. So with this, I would like to thank you for joining today. I hope that this session was helpful for your daily work, and hope to see you again in some of our other webinars or in face-to-face training sessions. And with this, thank you, Jane, for supporting me for organizing all these questions. And I would like to say goodbye to all of you. Stay safe and healthy. Have a nice rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you, Caroline. Bye-bye.